Okay. We're now recording so that we can post this online later on for those who missed it. Welcome to all of you to the second week of the Bible as Backstory. And I'd like to open with a prayer. The Lord be with you and also with you. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and ever hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Savior Jesus Christ, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Okay, good to see you all. I will start with just a reminder of some of the things that we talked about last week, some of the basic assumptions for this class as it goes on. The first being the definition of the Christian Bible for the sake of this, which is that the Christian Bible is a library of ancient writings collected for corporate use as the genetic or adopted backstory for a Christian's life of faith. And what is a backstory? It is the history or background for a character in a story. And of course, we are all characters in the story of this universe. And as individual human beings, we all have our own backstories. Part of the point of this class is to try to connect our own backstories with the grand backstories of the Christian faith, which of course start with the stories of the Jewish faith. Another guiding assumption of this class is that there is no such thing as an uninterpreted biblical text. It's just a question of how, when, and through whom the interpretation is happening. You could be reading someone else's interpretation, but if you're just reading the straight received text, you are probably reading it through a translation. And even if you're not, even if you can read in ancient Hebrew or ancient Greek, you are still applying your own backstory to that story, whether you know it or not. And so the more you can examine your own backstory and your own assumptions, the more useful that text can become to you. So last week we had the two creation stories in Genesis, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They follow right on each other. And I imagine for some of you it was news that there are two different stories, or that they were not intended originally to be related to each other. That the second one most likely came as a response to the Hebrews' time in Babylonian exile. Today is actually going to follow a similar pattern, and it's not a pattern that will continue after this week, but you'll remember that last week I read you at least a snippet of the creation story from the Babylonians. Today I have more than one story for you, two stories from Genesis of the flood. And yes, there are two, although it's not as abundantly clear this time as it is in Genesis 1 and 2. And also, I have an ancient Mesopotamian flood story to share with you as well. And actually, that's the story I'm going to share with you first. And this time, I think it's brief enough that I can read you the whole thing. This again comes out of this book called Marduk the Mighty, a collection of children's stories by Andrew Matthews, illustrated by Sheila Moxley. And I hope that by making that clear on the screen that nobody will get upset with the fact that I'm reading copyrighted material out of this book. If someone gets upset with me, I'll apologize for that. But this is important stuff and I want to share it with you. So this is the story in that children's book called The Great Flood. In the ancient land of Mesopotamia, the great city of Shuruppak stood on the banks of the river Euphrates. Here the gods lived in beautiful temples, and because Shuruppak was a holy city, it prospered. But in time, the city grew too large. The clamor of the people in the streets was so loud that it disturbed the gods' rest. The people became proud. Their riches made them forget to pray and give offerings to the gods. The gods met in angry council. Angriest of all was Enlil. All day and night the people bellow like wild animals, he declared. Sleep is impossible. Our temples are empty and humankind has lost all respect for us. I will send a famine to reduce the numbers of people so that we can have peace. So Enlil dried up all the rivers and took the clouds from the sky. No rain fell. Crops withered in the fields. Soon the people of Shuruppak began to die of thirst and hunger. But still there was no peace. The suffering people shrieked and wailed so much that the gods could find no rest. "Enough," cried Enlil. "I will send a great flood to destroy humankind and wash the earth clean of their memory." Now there was one man in Shuruppak who had stayed faithful to the god Ea. His name was Utnapishtim, and every day he prayed and made offerings at Ea's temple. When Ea heard of Enlil's plan, he visited Utnapishtim's house at night and spoke to him in a voice like the whispering of the wind through a bed of reeds. "A great flood is coming," Ea whispered. "Tear down your house and use the wood to build a boat. Make it big enough for you and your family and all the creatures of the earth. Set a roof over the top and seal the wood with pitch so no water can come in. But tell no one that it was I who gave you warning, for if Enlil hears of it, you will perish." Utnapishtim obeyed Ea. He built the boat and filled it with animals and all the treasures of his house. Utnapishtim's neighbors thought he had gone crazy. "What are you doing?" they asked. "Enlil is angry with me," replied Utnapishtim. "He has banished me from the city. I am going to make my home on the sea." In all, it took 7 days to make and load the boat. On the evening of the 7th day, the lords of hell set the land alight with flaming torches. The cries and screams of the people were drowned out by a mighty clap of thunder, and then the rains came. There had never been such rain before. It crashed down on the earth in a great wave, and all the people of Shuruppak were drowned. For 6 days and nights the storm raged, but on the morning of the 7th day all was calm, and the earth was silent. There was nothing to see but Utnapishtim's boat floating on an unmoving sea that stretched from horizon to horizon. After many days, the floods began to go down. The topmost peak of Mount Nisir appeared above the water, and the boat drifted against it and stuck fast. Utnapishtim's sons began to laugh for joy. "Father, the flood must be over," they cried. "Throw open the doors so we can walk on dry land again." "Not yet," said Utnapishtim. "I will send out a dove. If there is enough dry land, the dove will find food and build a nest. But if the land is still underwater, the dove will return." So Utnapishtim released a dove, but it came back, tired out from flying over the water. 7 days later, Utnapishtim sent out a swallow, but it also returned. Finally, Utnapishtim sent out a raven, and the raven did not come back. "The land is dry," shouted Utnapishtim. "Let us leave the boat. We must give thanks to the gods for sparing us." Utnapishtim and his family built an altar and prayed. They burned incense as an offering, and the gods gathered around the sweet smell like flies swarming around a jar of honey. Enlil was furious that anyone had survived the flood, but before he could destroy Utnapishtim and his family, Ea spoke. "This is a good man who has always stayed faithful to the gods. His children and his children's children will build a better, peaceful world." Then Enlil's anger cooled. He blessed Utnapishtim and his wife with immortality and told them to make their home in the land beyond the mountain of Mashu. And the world began anew. Well, does any of that sound familiar? Someone tell me what sounds familiar to you.
I mean, it sounds like the Noah story, right?
It's pretty similar, isn't it? What specifically did you hear? I mean, it's obvious that there's not only a parallel to the Noah flood story, but there are a lot of really specific details as well that are similar. What did you hear?
Well, once again, Aya, I think, was the god from the Babylonian story that was portrayed as the Jewish god in the flood story that we know.
Right, right.
The boat.
The boat, right? There, he had to build a boat, right? In this case, tear down your house and build a boat out of wood.
The birds.
The birds, sending
Well,
out the bird.
dove
The dove.
specifically.
Yeah, the dove specifically. You know what I noticed was missing though? No animals. No animals on the boat.
Oh, yeah.
But before we get too much into that,
Didn't
go
he
ahead.
say to load up all the animals?
Did I read that and
I
miss it?
think they said to load up all the animals.
Did I miss that?
I think it said that he loaded up all of his animals.
Oh no, you're right. Make it big enough for you and your family and all the creatures of the earth. It was
Okay.
there. It was there. It was just not heavily emphasized in that version. So yeah, you're right. That's sorry, I wasn't paying close attention. So before we go any further, as my Old Testament professor would always say, go back to the source, go back to the source. Don't assume that you know what the biblical story says. So with that in mind, I want to invite two people who did not read last week to help us out with reading from Genesis this week. All right, Billy's one. I'm looking for another. Someone's got to want to do this.
You know I'll always read, but I read last week.
I know, KJ, I'm holding out. Oh, Carol, I see Carol's hand. Very good. Okay. So Billy and Carol, let's see. And Carol, I'll ask you to get as close to your mic as you can, because in my experience, I sometimes have trouble hearing you on your machine. So very good. So Billy and Carol, I'm going to, here's what I'm going to do is put this up on the screen for you to see. And actually, before I do, I want to preface this by saying that you may not have realized before that there are not one, but two flood stories in Genesis. They are hiding there as two different stories in plain view of each other. One reason you might not realize this is that when we read the flood story in church, which most commonly happens at the Easter Vigil, we only read portions of it. We read certain selected verses, and it skips around a lot. If you look at the citation for the Easter Vigil, it's a very long citation with lots of commas, lots of breaks in between verses. And that's because the whole flood story takes up 3 chapters of Genesis. And that's what we're going to read now. It'll probably take us about 15 minutes. So I'm going to ask Billy to read the left-hand column and Carol to read the right-hand column. What I've done is to take the story and split it in 2. Now, can you all see this okay? Oops.
Yes.
Hang on, I'm going to shift some things around on my end. There we go, so that I can see what I'm doing. Can everyone see every part of the page? If anyone has any...
I only see a portion of it.
Yeah, if you're having trouble seeing, which portion can you see? Can you see the left column or the right column, Billy?
I see part of the left column.
Can you see enough of the left column that if I arrow down while you're reading, you'll be able to read everything?
I think so.
Okay, and Carol, you'll be able to read the right-hand side? I think you might be on mute, Carol.
The right-hand side doesn't show now.
Right, there's no text there yet, but you can see the box, right, Carol? Okay, so I hid everybody so that I could see what I'm doing. Carol, are you talking? I can't hear you. I still can't. Hang on, I'm going to stop the share for a minute. And what if I unmute you? It's not working. Apparently you don't have a microphone set up, so that's not going to work for some reason. Oh, wait, there you go. Now try.
I just had a prompt.
Oh,
Can
it
you
was.
hear?
Okay, you were working, but now you're frozen. Try again.
Is it working now?
Yes, much better, and we can hear you quite well. Okay, good. So I'm going to share my screen again. Now, what you'll see here in the headers, on the left-hand side, we have the J reader. And on the right-hand side, we have the P reader. Now, the J and the P refer to specific scholarly interpretations of who wrote which parts of the Hebrew Bible. Starting in the 19th century, a guy named Julius Wellhausen came up with the theory of multiple writers of the Old Testament. And really what we're talking about here is not people who wrote originally, but people who compiled pre-existing ideas into their portion of what they wrote. Now, there was a real value among the ancient Hebrews that if there is text that is sacred, you never throw it out. So what happens if there are two sacred stories that are two different tellings of the same thing? Well, you keep them both. In the case of the creation stories, they put one after the other. But in the case of the Noah story, some ingenious person, probably the P writer, wove them together. Well, maybe not the P writer. I think actually I'm going to take that back, because you have the J writer and then the P writer, and then you have somebody later on who edited them together without deleting much, if anything. So I want to hear Billy read the J column on the left and Carol read the P column on the right, and I will scroll down as needed. Are you ready?
Ready?
All right, go for it, Billy.
The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. And the Lord was sorry that he had made humankind on the earth, and it grieved him to his heart. So the Lord said, I will blot out from the earth the human beings I have created, people together with animals and creeping things and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord.
These are the descendants of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God, and Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now the earth was corrupt in his sight, and the earth was filled with violence. And God saw that the earth was corrupt, for all the flesh had corrupted its ways upon the earth. And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence because of them. Now I am going to destroy them along with the earth. Make yourself an ark of cypress wood, make rooms in the ark, and cover it inside and out with pitch. This is how you are to make it. The length of the ark, 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. Make a roof for the ark and finish it to a cubit above, and put the door of the ark in its side. Make it with lower, second, and third decks. For my part, I am going to bring a flood of waters on the earth, destroy from under heaven all flesh in which is breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. But I establish my covenant with you, and you shall come into the ark, you, your sons, your wives, and your sons' wives with you, and every living thing of all flesh. You shall bring 2 of every kind into the ark, to keep them alive with you. They shall be male and female, of the birds according to their kinds, and of animals according to their kinds, and every thing of the ground according to its kind. Of every kind shall come in to keep them alive. Also with you every kind of food that is eaten, and store it up, and shall serve as food for you and for them. Noah did this. He did all that God commanded him.
Then the Lord said to Noah, go into the ark, you and all your household, for I have seen that you alone are righteous before me in this generation. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and its mate, and 7 pairs of the birds of the air, also male and female, keep their kind alive on the face of the earth. For in 7 days I will send rain on the earth for 40 days and 40 nights. And every living thing that I have made I will blot out from the face of the ground. And Noah did all the Lord had commanded him.
Noah was 600 years old when the flood of the waters came on the earth.
And Noah with his sons and his wife and his sons' wives went into the ark to escape the waters of the flood.
Of the clean animals and of animals that are not clean, and of birds and everything that creeps on the ground, 2 and 2, male and female, went into the ark with Noah, as God had commanded him. And after 7 days, the waters of the flood came on. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, on the 11th day of the month, and on that day all the fountains of great deep burst forth, and the windows of the heaven were opened.
The rain fell on the earth 40 days and 40 nights.
Your microphone is unmuted. Your
On the
video is
very
off.
same day,
Just a minute. We got some. What's going on? Oh, okay. Are we good? Okay. I'm going to share the screen again.
There's an iPhone app there.
Pardon?
There was somebody on iPhone.
Oh, is that you, Stephen? On iPhone. Stephen, you have 2 accounts on at once. I'm not sure why, but I see who you are. So we're just going to continue. Okay.
on the very same day, Noah with his sons, Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Noah's wife, and the 3 wives of his sons entered the ark. They and every wild animal of every kind, and all domestic animals of every kind, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every bird of every kind, every bird, every winged creature. They went into the ark with Noah, 2 and 2 of all flesh, in which there was the breath of life. And those that entered, male and female, of all flesh, went in as God had commanded him.
And the Lord shut him in. The flood continued 40 days on the earth, and the waters increased and bore up the ark. It rose high above the earth. The water swelled and increased greatly on the earth, and the ark floated on the face of the waters.
The waters swelled so mightily on the earth that all the high mountains under the whole heaven were covered. The waters swelled above the mountains, covering them 15 cubits deep, and all the flesh died that moved on the earth, domestic animals, wild animals, all swarming creatures that swarm on the earth, and all human beings. Everything on dry land in whose nostrils was the breath of life died.
He blotted out every living thing that was on the face of the ground, human beings and animals, and creeping things and birds of the air. They were blotted out from the earth. Only Noah was left, and those that were with him in the ark.
And the waters swelled on the earth for 150 days. But God remembered Noah and all the wild animals and all the domestic animals that were with him in the ark. And God made a wind blow over the earth, and the waters subsided. The fountains of the deep and the windows of the heaven were closed. The rain from the heavens was restrained, and the water gradually receded from the earth. At the end of 150 days, the waters had abated. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the Mount of and the waters continued to abate till the 10th. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, tops of the mountains appeared.
At the end of 40 days, Noah opened the window of the ark that he had made and sent out the raven, and it went to and fro until the waters were dried up on the earth. Then he sent out the dove for him to see if the waters had subsided from the face of the ground. But the dove found no place to set its foot, and it returned to him to the ark, where the waters were still on the face of the whole earth. So he put out his hand and took it and brought it into the ark with him. He waited another 7 days, and again he sent out the dove from the ark. And the dove came back to him in the evening, and there in its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. So Noah knew that the waters had subsided from the earth. Then he waited another 7 days and sent out the dove, and it did not return to him anymore.
In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried up from the earth.
And Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and saw that the face of the ground was drying.
In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dry. Then Noah said to God, Then God said to Noah, go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the ground, on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth. So Noah went out with his sons and wives, his sons' wives, and every animal, every creeping thing, every bird, everything that moves on the earth went out of the ark by families.
Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took of every clean animal and of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing odor, the Lord said in his heart, I will never again curse the ground because of humankind, for the inclination of the human heart is evil from youth. Nor will I ever again destroy every living creature as I have done. As long as the earth endures, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease.
God blessed Noah and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth. The fear and dread of you shall rest on every animal of the earth, and on every bird of the air, everything that creeps in the ground, and on all the fish of the sea. Into your hand they are delivered. Every moving thing that lives shall be food for you. And just as I gave you the green plants, I give you everything. Only you shall not eat flesh without its life, that is, its blood. For your own lifeblood will surely require a reckoning. From every animal I will require it, and from human beings, each one for the blood of another, I will require a reckoning for human life. Whoever sheds the blood of a human, by a human, shall that person's blood be shed. For in his own image God made humankind. And you, be fruitful and multiply, abound on the earth and multiply in it. Then God said to Noah and to his sons with him, as for me, I am establishing my covenant with you and your descendants after you, and with every living creature that is with you, the birds, the domestic animals, and every animal of the earth with you, as many came out of the ark. I established my covenant with you, that never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of a flood, and never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for a few generations. I have set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature of all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth."
The sons of Noah went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was peopled.
Okay, that's it. That is the entire Noah story straight out of the Bible. And I forgot to mention this, but the highlighted parts in yellow are the parts that we read at the Great Vigil of Easter when we read this story. Notice that it's probably only about half the story, but it's not all the same half. It goes back and forth. Do you see that?
Yes.
So now that you know the real deal on Noah, what do you think? Initial reactions to that? Yeah, Brian.
Well, I gotta wonder, you hear of the story of, I think it was Krakatoa, the mountain, the volcano that exploded and supposedly wiped out Atlantis. I wonder if it's a similar origin story because of the rains. I can imagine a volcano causing a lot of rain. Also, another question, who got the crappy job of counting the fleas?
Right. Yeah, there was a comedian once who said 2 mosquitoes, male and female. Let's see. Did I see Bill had something?
Yeah, I just wondered if you could comment on why the yellow portions were chosen and why the other portions were left out. There must have been some rationale other than let's keep the service short.
Right. Well, I mean, honestly, was it enjoyable to listen to 3 solid chapters? I mean, there was a lot of repetition going on there, wasn't there? And that's not a way to tell a story. I mean, if I were the editor, if you've ever edited someone else's writing, and if that has ever involved you saying to the person, try to say the same thing with a lot fewer words, I would want to say that to this writer. So why was that section chosen? Why were the highlighted sections chosen? I can't speak to it specifically, but I would say because that's what we need to have the bare minimum of the story. Likewise, I mean, I think there is something about keeping the reading short and bite-sized enough that people can absorb it. Likewise, when we tell the story of the Red Sea at the Great Vigil, that's such a long story that we only begin as they're about to cross the sea and Pharaoh and the chariots are bearing down on them. That's where we start. Never mind that there were all the plagues and everything in between, because that goes chapter after chapter after chapter. Did you notice differences between the J source and the P source in general? And maybe Billy and Carol could speak to this because you're the ones who read it. What did you notice? Or anybody, what did anybody notice?
One of each, male and female, and the P, I think it was, and J had 7.
Yes, right? If anyone asks you how many of each animal did Noah bring on the ark, it's not a fair question. You can't answer that because we have 2 different versions. Yeah.
And they,
Wasn't it just 7 sets of birds, not just the animals, just of the birds? Well, they had to sacrifice something when they got off the boat, right?
Right. They had to have a sacrifice at the other end, right? So, and they had to bring the clean and the unclean, and it was much more complicated in that version. Yeah.
Yeah, well, and they clearly kind of fouled that up in terms of ecologic manipulation, because they ended up sacrificing a lot of clean pears at the end and sort of wiping out the pears. Because I heard it too, that they had plenty of birds that they could sacrifice a pear, but they didn't have plenty of clean pairs of animals, so they sort of wiped out a bunch of clean pairs and left the unclean pairs.
Well, and remember too that unclean does not mean this animal shouldn't exist, right? Clean and unclean is just two different classifications for the purpose of temple worship. Deb, you had your hand up, so I'll call on you.
Oh, I was just saying the whole section on the blood reckoning was brand new to me.
Right? And what a strange placement there too. It sounds like something out of Leviticus or something. That if you take a human life, then a human life is to be reckoned. Yeah, that's right. I saw KJ's hand.
Yeah, I was gonna say what she said. I never heard that before, or I don't remember it. But also, I'm confused by the part about the animals and not. Were they saying to be vegetarian?
Which part are you referring to?
It was right. It was that blood. I didn't write down the exact words. They were talking about don't eat the living blood of an animal or something.
Okay, no. So what you've got there is the very, very beginnings of preparing meat in a kosher way, right? So with the blood in it is the question, and that will lead to the proper procedures for how you sacrifice and how you eat. That's right.
Thanks. That makes sense.
Yeah, Brian.
The P version had a lot more details and a lot more numbers.
Yes, very good. And that's true of the P source throughout the Old Testament. So P stands for priestly. And this is a later source. This is a source probably writing during or after the exile. And the priestly source is very concerned about very precise details. The J source is much more ancient and tends to be a lot earthier, a lot more raw. The P source tends to be very kind of above the fray and in control. And those are differences that you see throughout, yeah. Incidentally, the four main sources that Wellhausen identified that has sort of become the dominant theory of biblical source criticism are the J source, which stands for Yahweh in German, the P source for priestly, the E source, which is the Elohist source, and I'll say very little about that because sometimes I usually can't tell the difference between the J and the E source. They're so similar, and many scholars can't tell the difference. And then the D source, who is the Deuteronomist, and he's writing after the rest later on. Did I say P was? I think I might have given a date too late for the priestly source. I think that I'd have to clear up that. I don't quite remember now. And Brian, one more, yeah.
I do have to question, were either of these stories prior to the Babylonians taking over the Jews?
Certainly the J source, absolutely. And the P source, I'm not sure of. But in this case, we're not comparing, when I read you that story, it was not necessarily a Babylonian flood myth. It was a Mesopotamian flood myth, which is probably much older than that. So it may be one that they were already familiar with, and that may be why there's so much more in common between those two stories than there were when there was a Babylonian creation story to counter with something very different. Yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah, Billy.
I noticed that P said that humans would have all the moving things in the earth for their food. Does this mean that prior to that, humans were herbivores?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that, because if you read the Adam and Eve story in more detail and the parts that we didn't get to read last week, you'll see that God gives Adam and Eve the fruits of the earth to eat. There's no mention of them eating animals. But after the fall, after the eating of the fruit, after they're banished from the garden, one of the first things that happens is that God makes clothing for them out of animal skins, which is very odd. But it's the first indication of animals dying for the sake of human beings. So make of that what you will. So a couple, go
I
ahead,
think
Bill.
one thing theologically that struck me is that
Good transition.
this is a story that God says, boy, I fouled up. I made a bunch of crummy humans. I got to get rid of this and start over again. That's pretty impressive theologically.
It is. That's exactly right. And, you know, there's more of that in the Old Testament than we might realize. We'll eventually get to Moses. And when God gets so upset with the people in the desert, he says to Moses, that's it, stand back. I'm going to wipe all of them out, but you and your family will start a new nation for me. And Moses says, don't do that. Don't do that. It's not worthy of you. You made promises to them. Are you a God who goes back on promises? And God says, oh, you're right. And he doesn't destroy them. So the more ancient understandings of God, the J source especially, are very human. Look again at the creation stories. The J source God gets down in the mud and makes Adam out of the mud of the earth. The P source, writing Genesis 1 much, much later, it's just this notion of a perfect God, maybe even a God without a lot of emotion, who just poof, just makes things, ex nihilo, right? Very different understandings of what God is like, and they're both there all the way through the Hebrew Bible. So if someone asks you, is God more like someone who is close to you and who speaks in your heart and who loves you and tenderly cares for you? Or is God more like some distant hairy thunderer out there flinging lightning bolts from above? There's no easy answer to that, because both of those conceptions of God exist simultaneously throughout the Bible. I wanted to talk a little about myth. We've been dealing with first the creation story, then the flood story. We're still dealing with primordial stuff, right? At this point, for most Christians today, there's no question that we are not dealing with literal events. You'll find many Christians out there who are still hanging on to this notion that if it's in the Bible, it literally happened. But science has shown us, and everything we've learned through the Enlightenment for hundreds of years has shown us, and also the earlier people knew full well that these are myths. But in our day and age, there's a bad connotation to the word myth, right? When someone says that it's only a myth, they mean it's not true. They mean that it's deceiving you. They mean that you should write it off. And that's not the definition of myth that we're talking about in this case. There's myth and there's falsehood, right? A falsehood is a fiction that is intended to deceive. But a myth is a fiction that is intended to give meaning to a culture. Now, that doesn't mean that all myths are good. Some myths are very destructive. There are falsehoods that can be, falsehoods are usually meant to deceive, but myths can be helpful or harmful. And I want to give a few examples of more recent myths. And after I rattle off a few, you might be able to think of more. Here's a myth for you. Christopher Columbus discovered America. Right? It's a myth. We know it's not true. There were people here. So that's a very, very basic and simple one. But what you want to think about then is, what reality is that myth designed to support? What does that tell you? If Christopher Columbus discovered America, what does that mean? One answer.
Well, like, it means that Europeans are the best or something like that, you know?
Well, not only that, but it means Europeans have a claim on the land.
Exactly.
Right? If Christopher Columbus discovered it, well, it's his, he gets to keep it. So by cutting out the inconvenient fact that there were all these millions of people here, we tell a completely different story. Here's another one. George Washington chopped down a cherry tree, but when caught, he could not tell a lie. He said he did it. Well, that's a myth. We know that didn't literally happen. But what idea does that story support? Brian. Derek has to unmute you there. What?
He's dumb.
He's dumb. I mean, but in all honesty, right? He was honest. He could not tell a lie. So that means the father of our country, the first president, was a very, very honorable and upright man, right? That's what that is designed to support. Here's another one. Oh, this one's a hot button one. You'll hear people say it sometimes, and it makes my blood boil. The Civil War was not actually about slavery. It was just about economics. Anyone ever heard that one before? There's a destructive myth, right? Because then it means, oh, we're not really racist, right? The fact of the matter is, of course, it was about slavery, and it was about the economics of slavery. That was the whole point. Here's another one, and this is one I just discovered. Mussolini made the trains run on time. No, he didn't. The trains didn't run any better in particular when Mussolini was the dictator than they did before, but it supports the notion that the Italians, in following Mussolini, did have some logic to following this ruthless dictator, right? They weren't all bad for making that decision. There's one more, and this one is very recent, and you may have fallen for this one yourself. I'm going to share this on the screen. I'm going to read you a poem. Oh, how can I get to it? Here it is. Here's a poem. Came across this poem written in 1869, reprinted during the 1919 pandemic, written in 1869 by Kathleen O'Mara. And people stayed home and read books and listened, and they rested and did exercises and made art and played and learned new ways of being and stopped and listened more deeply. Someone meditated, someone prayed, someone met their shadow, and people began to think differently, and people healed. And in the absence of people who lived in ignorant ways, dangerous, meaningless, and heartless, the earth also began to heal. And when the danger ended and people found themselves, they grieved for the dead and made new choices and dreamed of new visions and created ways of living and completely healed the earth just as they were healed. Reprinted during the Spanish flu pandemic, 1919. Isn't that a wonderful myth? You know when that poem was actually written? In the year 2020 for this pandemic. So myths do not take long. What's that?
You can tell from the language. It's not.
Totally. You can totally tell from the language that it was not from 1869. That's right. So the point is that myths can be helpful or harmful. But also, more importantly, a thing doesn't have to be factual to be helpful. And I hope that we will teach our children and grandchildren this deeper meaning of mythology to help them understand that myths should not be judged by their factuality, but by their usefulness for the purpose of love. I mean, knowing something didn't literally happen doesn't automatically make it useless, but we can always ask more about the purposes that the myth is serving.
Well, I think the problem, though, is much more complex because it's very nuanced. There's myths that have some relationship to discernible factuality. There's other myths that are just created out of, cloth, of new cloth. Like your Mussolini reference, there was a neat NPR series or OPB series that some might have seen, where Rick Steves went through fascism in Europe and pointed out that, in fact, after World War I, the societies of much of Europe were very chaotic, and the fascist dictators, but particularly Mussolini, who was the first, did bring a lot of social order to Italy that was really very chaotic at the time. Now, the harm he did was incalculable, but in fact, it's not surprising that some of the ascendancy of Mussolini was in fact based on a need for the Italian society to have greater order than they had out of chaos.
And that's encapsulated in the mythical statement, Mussolini made the trains run on time, right? Even though he didn't. So before we only have a few minutes left. This time goes so fast. Real quick, looking at the Noah stories. As you heard these, did anything surprise you that you haven't mentioned yet, or challenge your assumptions? Meg.
I think I'd heard it, but oh, did I cut somebody off? Sorry.
No, go ahead.
The part about Noah being 600 years old, I think I'd heard that and kind of knew that somewhere in my mind, but I think, oh, my knees would not hold. How did he, was he even able to walk at 600? That one kind of surprised me.
Before the Gregorian calendar.
Right. Well, I noticed that in the Mesopotamian story, the Ushtapitnim and his wife were granted immortality.
Exactly.
Oh, wow, that outdoes Noah. But yeah, of course, we have all sorts of stories in Genesis of people living for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then gradually that gets scaled back, and there are all sorts of theories about why that is. Meg, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to comment on the immortality in the Mesopotamian story too.
Right, good. Elisa.
What part of what struck me of that too, with Noah being 600, and who knows how old his wife was, but that his kids and their wife didn't have kids. How old were they? And yet they didn't have kids, you know?
Right. So it shows you how when you try to get into tortured explanations of how to make this literal, you go off the rails real fast. There's really no point. Yeah.
Well, and I think one of the other things is in biblical scholarship, how much time has been sort of wasted not understanding the mythical nature of the stories in terms of, well, let's spend years and years looking for the archaeologic evidence of the Noah's story. You know, I mean, the number of people that have claimed to find pieces of the ark, and which mountain did he really land upon, and how big was the flood, and was this really just a localized? I mean, there's just books written that are sort of wasted time because they don't accept the mythical nature of the story.
Well, yeah, and for the flood, I think it's a little different than a lot of the other stuff. I don't worry too much about the parting of the Red Sea or where the Garden of Eden was exactly. But there are a lot of flood stories in all sorts of Middle Eastern cultures, which makes me think, okay, there was some flooding going on because they needed to write about it and make sense of it as a culture. And then I heard that the last ice age only ended in about 10,000 BC. And I thought, wow, if there was a whole bunch of melting after that ice age, that was just about long enough ago that there could be some real corporate memories of some severe flooding. I believe that. But I also don't think it's that important, right? That what's more important to our purposes is, why were these stories preserved? What is the importance of them? What do they tell us? Last week, we talked about the word etiology, etiology, and I'll just put it up here again in the chat so you can see it. An etiology is an explanation of how something came to be, something that we can never know how it came to be, or we have no way of knowing. And so the people come up with a fanciful story. Did you hear a really big etiology in the Noah story? I did.
The what I got from it was that in the end, it was God's reconciling nature, with humankind.
Yes, and what was the symbol? The rainbow. The rainbow. How do rainbows come to be? They're so pretty. They're so unique. Why, they're not always here. What do they mean? Oh, it's God reminding us of God's love. But this is after God throwing a temper tantrum and destroying everything. And it makes me wonder, why do we think of this as a children's story? I mean, isn't this, when you look at children's Bibles in the bookstore, don't they so often have an ark full of animals on the cover? Why is this the story that we give our children?
Because children like animals.
Because it's got animals in it, right? For some reason. But that's not really looking very deeply. So what are the elements of the story, or the stories, that might inform a people's understanding of itself? What does it say about who God is that it's valuable going forward? Brian.
If you do everything God wants of you, you'll be old for eternity.
Or at least 600, right? No, I mean, really, what do a people find fit to preserve because it tells them more about who they are and who God is?
We're bad and God is good.
Okay. I mean, that's certainly clearly here, isn't it? And we hear God saying, this is interesting. In the J source, he repents of having destroyed everything and says, I see now that people are always evil from the beginning, and therefore I'm not going to destroy them again. It's like God throwing up the divine hands and saying, destroying them, there's no point to this because I can't fix them. They are this way, and I'm the one who has to figure out how to handle that.
But on the flip side of that, then you have God apologizing to Job.
That's right, and Job comes much later, and I would love to talk more about Job because that's one of my favorite books.
One thing.
Oh, hang on, Brian. I saw Mary's hand.
The thing that I like with this part is the end where he makes the covenant not to do it again. And there's been times in my own life I've thought, thank you, God, that you made that covenant.
Yep.
And sometimes you have to kind of count on that yourself. So I like that part.
And yet, as we said, on Mount Sinai, God almost goes back on that, right? He doesn't wipe out the whole world, but he's planning to wipe out the Israelites and start over. So yeah, we have sort of a capricious God from time to time. Yeah, Brian.
One thing that I was going to point out is that they can all say we all were descendants of Noah. We were all descendants of the one good man.
That's right. That everybody on earth was, right? It's a restoring of the original goodness. Now, the very next thing, anyone know what the very next thing that happens in the narrative is? Right after this? Someone's got to know this. What's the next thing Noah does?
I think I know.
Okay, Billy.
Oh, there was a time when Noah got drunk.
Right. Noah plants a vineyard. He makes wine. He drinks the wine. He gets really drunk. This happens just boom, boom, boom like this. And then he lies naked in his tent. And one of his sons comes upon him naked in the tent. And the language is very vague, but something shameful happens there. And one of the sons acts in a way that is not described, but is supposed to be abominable. And the other two sons cover up their father's nakedness, so he rewards them when he sobers up. And the other son gets cursed. It's very weird and confusing. And there are all sorts of things like that in the depths of the earliest stories. Just a couple other things to mention before we shift into Compline. We hear in this, we mentioned this, God is sorry that he had made humankind, but then gets over it. God calls out one righteous family to save. And you can imagine that that could be really helpful to a people in exile or a people in slavery, right? That, well, if we're the righteous ones, then God's looking out for us and God's going to get us through this. And God keeps promises. God makes promises and keeps promises. This is going to come up again and again and again throughout the Hebrew scriptures. So we're going to shift into Compline, but just something to go out thinking about and wondering about. Does the flood story inform your backstory in any way? Are there any pieces from this that have value for you in your self-identity and in your understanding of your relationship with God? I won't ask for answers to that right now because it's after 8 and we need to shift now. But that's, I guess that's your homework. And I haven't started planning next week. So I'm going to stop the recording now. And when this is finished, it'll go online on the Facebook page so that those who missed it can see it later.